What happens when the person everyone underestimates becomes the one mind holding the line together, while bullets rip through the valley and commanders scramble to adapt? A young medic reads terrain, predicts casualty flow, directs movement, and makes impossible decisions under pressure. This hook is about leadership without rank, authority without noise, and the kind of composure that turns disbelief into loyalty in the middle of chaos.
The radio crackled before her voice cut through the chaos, eerily composed for a valley on fire. As hellfire rained from the ridgelines and the night shattered, she addressed 480 souls with an unteachable poise. Alpha, move west 150 meters, she ordered. Secure the ravine, now. Pinned down, Commander Nate Harwick felt the fight shift in a way his 30 years in the Corps couldn't comprehend. 480 of the military's best were trapped in a kill zone. The bigwigs had promised a cakewalk, a routine op in mountains they had patrolled for 2 decades. That intel was pure garbage. The eastern assault was precise, not random. Then the west lit up. The valley turned into a graveyard in less than 2 minutes. Red streaks tore through the dark. To his left, a man cried out. To his right, 2 went still, a profound and final quiet. He keyed his radio. "Doc, what's your 20? 5 seconds of static felt like a goddamn eternity. Pinned, sir. Got eyes north. Mortars are shifting east. Get your wounded clear." She broke in before he could answer, her tone absolute. "Move your people, Commander. I am holding this line." Harwick just stared at his handset. No one had ever jacked his command net like that. It wasn't that she was fearless, but that she owned her fear, a power he had rarely seen. He followed her order. Veterans would later fail to find the words for that night. Every story was the same. No one on the comms had ever sounded like her. She was their rock. She gripped the radio, her shoulder bleeding from a bullet wound. Blood soaked her fatigues as a vicious cold set in, but her focus was a razor's edge. Her hand was steady, and her voice never broke. 477 men saw the dawn because of what she did, but that is the end. This story starts 18 hours before, with a chopper crew flying headfirst into a trap. They were going in completely blind. The forward operating base was a speck at 6,000 feet, just 3 prefabs and a sat dish inside a razor wire fence. For the unit, perimeter patrols were just another Tuesday. Sheer cliffs walled them in. The thin, biting air was a feature they had long ago gotten used to. You get used to what you cannot change. The cold was a constant. At 1700 hours, the last helicopter landed, its rotors kicking up a storm of dust. A crewman tossed out equipment as one person disembarked. The bird was lifting off before her boots hit the ground. The rotor wash blasted her, but she moved forward, resolute. The camp's layout was already known, burned into her mind from a classified file, but that same file held something more. A secret she kept locked down tight. That secret was the real purpose of her being there. The pack on her back and the case in her hand were both standard-issue government junk. Clad in gray utility trousers, she walked across the landing zone with a practiced calm. Petty Officer First Class Colt Briggs watched her, a data pad in his hand. He was a giant, 6'2", and pure muscle. He judged her with the same cool detachment he used for everything. He nudged the guy next to him. "Bet that pack weighs more than she does." The other Marine was silent. She was slight, maybe 5'4" and 120 pounds soaking wet. The gate guard had already checked her ID twice. Her eyes never stopped moving, not just seeing but dissecting the area around her. If Briggs had been paying attention, he'd have seen it. But he had already dismissed her. The manifest identified her as Tessa Cole, a civilian medic. NavSpec Warcom had called her in as a last-minute fill-in. Her file was immaculate. Johns Hopkins, expert in trauma medicine. 2 deployments, 53 saves in the field, with 0 fatalities. That last number had made Commander Harwick take notice. A 53-0 record in a war zone wasn't just being lucky. 40 minutes on, he found her at the aid station. She was already laying out supplies based on the op plan, her actions efficient and certain. She looked at him. "Commander, you've read the plan." "I have. Your assessment?" She cocked her head. "The casualty projection is optimistic. I'd raise it by 20%. He was dumbfounded. It will stress our logistics, she added. This tent will be overrun. I need 3 alternative casualty collection points. Harwick had been ready for the usual contractor complaints. He was not ready for someone to challenge his numbers. Make it happen, he ordered. As he walked back into the cold, he mentally labeled her unknown quantity. Briggs voiced his reservations 3 times before they ate. At the pre-mission inspection, he bitched that her medkit was too damn big. During the brief, she was glued to the topo map. The 3rd time was in the chow hall. He told 3 of his buddies she was a liability, saying it like it was gospel. In his world, that was the end of the discussion. Liabilities were why good men were shipped home in bags. They were the problem you eliminated before things went sideways. As far as he was concerned, he was just doing his job. He had no idea she heard him through the thin canvas. She just kept on eating. Her father taught her to hold her peace until it was time to speak. She'd lived by that rule for 16 years. At dusk, Chief Vance Dunar found her by the perimeter fence. At 53, he had a heavy calm the younger men lacked. It was the stillness of a man who had seen enough to be unshakable. He'd been watching her, his expression more thoughtful than critical. She was observing the darkness swallow the valley. He stood with her, quiet for a good minute. Frank Cole was your old man. She stopped breathing for a beat. He was, she said. Team 3, Desert Storm, Somalia, 3 trips to the sandbox. Hung it up in 2012. She finally looked at him. I was in Coronado with him back in 95, Dunar said. 24 and 10 feet tall, your dad fixed that. Frank took my ego apart in less than an hour, and he never even raised his voice. He never mentioned me, she said, her voice flat. Names weren't really his thing. That's Frank, Dunar agreed. But he mentioned his kid once, said you had the eye. He said it was the rarest thing he'd seen in 40 years, and that he was teaching you to trust it. She stayed quiet. He died in 2019. March 14th, a brain bleed. 57? He got through all those wars just to die in a stateside hospital. She gave the details with a medic's precision, the sting of the memory dulled by years. Dunar just nodded. Sorry to hear that, thank you. Night fell hard on the valley. The base generator hummed to life. Watching you with the map earlier, Dunar mentioned, you went straight for the high ground, the key terrain. That's all, Frank. Her only reply was her silence. Look, this ain't a shakedown, he continued. It's just a fact. I get the picture. Whatever your real job is here, you're with good people. The command staff had to be read in. Now I am. He turned and walked off. She stayed by the wire. To really get it, you need to know about Frank Cole. His name isn't in any history books. His official record is a ghost. He actively avoided pictures his whole life. In the teams, though, his story became a legend, passed from one operator to the next. He enlisted at 18. At BUDS, he had a strange sense of calm that threw off the instructors. He wasn't the biggest or the fastest, but when things got biblical, he could go to a place inside himself that Hell Week was made to break. Almost nobody could do that. He got his trident, perfected his trade, and was always adapting. He saw beyond the mission to the entire war. He was there for Desert Storm, Somalia, and the Battle of Mogadishu. That firefight in October taught a hard lesson about how bad an op can go. After 9/11, he did 3 tours in Afghanistan. His missions were buried so deep, no records request will ever find them. His old unit called him Ghost, a name he'd earned. He got out in 2012, putting down roots near San Diego. Life found a new rhythm, morning runs, rifle care, and instructing at a private range. For her 10th birthday, he gave her a rifle, not to forge a copy of himself. At 10, she learned its weight, a truth known to the children of warriors. It was a tool for a harder lesson, the cold math of ballistics and the heart of the Cassant, choice to use it. It was a lesson in violence and its cost. He trained her on weekends, in quiet summer dawns. She learned to read distance, feel the wind, control her breathing, and execute a clean trigger press. She absorbed the science of ballistics and a hunter's patience, learning the gulf between a shot you can make and one you must. At 16, she hit a 900-meter target in a crosswind. His only feedback, sloppy follow-through. She fixed it. It was the highest praise he would ever give. Her acceptance to Johns Hopkins earned his complete support. He believed her hands were built to heal, even after he had taught them how to take a life. He respected the paradox she represented. In March 2018, he wrote a final letter for her to find when he was gone. His heart was giving out. The medical reports were absolute. He met his end with tactical logic, putting his last intelligence to paper. He died March 14th, 2019, in a VA hospital of 57. She was a 21-year-old sophomore when the 0600 call broke her world. The entire framework of her life vanished. In that void, she started again. She went to her classes, one objective at a time, the way he taught her. 2 weeks later, she found the letter with his personal effects. She read it just once in her Denton dorm room in the pale winter light, then folded it. It was a permanent part of her kit. The memory returned as she moved to the aid station to rig her gear. She had already cached trauma supplies in 3 separate locations. An off-the-books prep, done solo in the dark, unseen. 4 hours before step-off, she found Lance Corporal Reed Kowalski. At 23, he was a boot, wound up tight before seeing the elephant. His rifle was pristine, its action smooth. He looked like a recruiting poster, a perfect weapon waiting to be fired. For 90 seconds, she watched, noting the slow, unnatural blink rate everyone else missed. Observation was her craft. His hands were firm, but the cadence was flawed, a tiny hesitation that signaled a problem. A Marine called out. Kowalski's head turned a split second too slow. Auditory processing delay. She moved in. Kowalski. He looked up, his expression empty. "Doc." "Don't move," she ordered, taking his pulse, checking his pupils. She fired 3 questions at him, gauging the lag, not the content. "You have heat stroke," she announced. "Set in yesterday. High core temperature, weak pulse. You are grounded for 3 hours, fluids and rack time." He began to object. "Doc, I'm got to go. Your cognitive speed is degraded by 12%. She cut in, her voice flat. "Not enough for you to feel. In a firefight, that delay gets you or your buddy killed. You're a liability. I can kick this up the chain." He processed his limited options, then met her gaze. "Roger that. I'm down." The IV was in his arm in under 20 seconds. Harwick, the CO, watched from a distance. With the saline flowing, she reported, "He'll be fit for duty in 3. Light duty till 1400. Harwick gave a single nod and moved on. Sergeant Briggs said nothing but stepped closer, his gaze fixed on her, his opinion of her visibly recalibrating. The brief kicked off at 1300. The tent was packed. Harwick delivered the brief with brutal economy. No word was wasted. Tessa hung back, a shadow, her concentration absolute. The map showed the AO. The objective was a weapons cache in an enemy compound 8 clicks away. Primary route was through the valley, with an alternate along the North Ridge. Staff Sergeant Alrek had overwatch. She was the only doc on the manifest. 40 minutes later, the talk shifted to sniper hides. Harwick pointed out 2 positions. "Grid 477 puts the team in the backblast," she said, her eyes on her notes. "The ledge at grid 479, 30 meters north, is clear and has a superior line of sight." The tent grew quiet. Harwick's stare shifted from the map to his medic. "Confirm. Topo map," she replied. He checked it for 5 seconds. He altered the plan to her coordinates. Briggs was 2 meters from her. She felt his stare without looking. The quiet reevaluation of a man witnessing pure competence. She made a final note and fell silent. The hours before a mission have their own specific gravity. On the FOB, all motion became economical. The ambient noise died as each Marine began his rituals. They broke down their rifles with a focus only combat can instill. She did a mental inventory of her aid bag, then paused. Her hand went to her chest, feeling the sharp corners of the letter through her blouse. It had rested there, over her heart, for 5 years. Her father understood a basic truth. The most critical moments of life never announce themselves. They just happen, so the important words have to be said early. He had given her everything she would need. The text was now a part of her, less a memory than the very architecture of her mind. It was as integral as bone. Her hand remained flat against her chest. Outside, as the sun set, the air developed a sharp edge. At 2100 hours, the helicopters lifted, hugging the contours of the earth. Tessa was in the second bird, watching the dark landscape streak past the door. Her mind was a still point, a calm he had taught her to build. The objective was 3 clicks beyond the valley. Intel suggested low risk. The drone footage showed nothing. A cakewalk. She understood the chasm between the brief and the reality. The true threat is never the one you plan for. She kept her doubts to herself. Her job wasn't to second-guess the mission, but to predict its failure points. They touched down 2 clicks out. The helos vanished, leaving behind only rotor wash and a profound, waiting silence. She found her place in the center of the column. Her stride was efficient, preserving strength for the fight. Vance Dunar was 3 men up on her left. A click in, he glanced back, his eyes finding hers with perfect, practiced precision. Their gazes held for a second before he turned away. She went back to reading the ridgelines, interpreting the terrain as if it were a printed page. At 3.5 clicks, she saw it. A slight heat shimmer over the rocks on the east ridge. At her 2 o'clock. A minor distortion in the air, almost nothing. 100 meters farther, she saw it again. A signal in the noise. Not a target, simply data. She logged the information without emotion. 3 clicks from the objective, the night shattered. The first rocket screamed from the east ridge. The concussion, a brutal blow to her chest. The shockwave hits your bones an instant before the sound arrives. Before the blast faded, both ridges erupted with muzzle flashes. A perfect L-shaped ambush. They'd been compromised. The enemy had the route, the timetable, all of it, none of which mattered for the next minute and a half. Survival was the only mission. The squad broke for cover on pure instinct. Tessa was already moving. She sprinted to a rock outcropping she'd previously marked, 12 meters out. She made it in 6 seconds, kit open. The first wounded man got to her 5 seconds later. Arm wound, shrapnel, packed and wrapped in under 2 minutes. Kowalski was going into shock. A 4-second look confirmed why. Femoral artery, no pressure. The tourniquet went on, high and tight. She packed the wound with combat gauze, applying savage, necessary force. She talked while she worked, her voice calm, feeding him data, not comfort. A man on the edge needs intel. Tourniquet is on. It's going to hurt. That is how you know it is working. Eyes on me. He complied. Good man. The third Marine was dragged to her. Deviated trachea, no breath sounds on one side, tension pneumothorax. He was drowning in his own chest. She found the 14-gauge needle, located the second intercostal space, and plunged it in. The hiss of escaping air was the sound of a life returning. She moved on. 2 machine guns had them pinned. The nests were dug in under a ledge, safe from direct fire. A tactical disaster. As she treated a 4th man, Harrelson was on the radio. Get me a fix on those guns, now! Albright was hit, his rifle 20 meters away. Her mind split its focus between medicine and tactics, tracking the enemy positions. After she stabilized the 4th Marine, her eyes met Dunar's. He was 17 meters out, his face confirming he saw the same lethal problem and was waiting for her solution. Her trauma pack hit the dirt. She grabbed the rifle, dropped it again. The heavy gun on the ridge hammered the ditch where 40 Marines were trapped. Each burst a tick of a clock counting down their lives. From an inside pocket, she drew the letter, its paper thin from 5 years of contact. She paused for 3 heartbeats. The words inside affirmed a truth her gut had always known, but her mind had just caught up. She tucked the letter away, her gaze meeting Dunar's. M24, she stated. Location? He didn't hesitate. Albright's rig, driver's side. She was already gone. The rifle was there. 16 years of drills took over as she gripped the cold steel. It wasn't a thought. It was pure instinct, forged by 1,000 days on the range until it was second nature. Like finding a light switch in your own bedroom. A round slid home. The safety clicked off. Her hand found the Schmidt and Bender 3x12 optic. The optic wasn't her first choice, but it was serviceable. She was already calculating the dope for the shot. Without a sound, Dunar moved left, their silent, rehearsed choreography. He set up 12 meters out, watching the northern flank and judging the wind. She was climbing before she consciously decided to. The incline was a sharp 35 degrees of shifting scree, and darkness was her only cover. She moved with a fluid efficiency, each step placed with purpose. The hailstorm of incoming rounds to her right was just another element to navigate, not something to escape. Sparks flew as 3 rounds hit rock 15 meters away. She shifted her route 4 meters and kept climbing. Dunar's voice crackled. Wind, ENE, 12 knots. Temps 41, 60 meters to the top. Information processed. Target at 780 meters. Her path gave her a superior angle the grunts below couldn't get. The enemy's rock cover was now irrelevant. She'd spotted this vulnerability back in the op brief. A shelf of rock offered a solid perch. She dropped prone. The rock's chill seeped in, a fact she noted and filed away. The bipod snapped into place. The rifle felt like a part of her. Through the scope, the nest was crystal clear. 2 hostiles, a gunner and a spotter on security. They knew their business. Dug in behind sandbags and rock, they had a 780-meter kill zone. She started her breathing cycle. Her mind went to a Texas sunrise. She was 10. Her dad explained shooting wasn't brute force. It was science, physics and anatomy, and the focus to make your body a perfect tool for one crucial moment. 5 years gets you competence, he'd said. 20 gets you artistry, the gap between luck and a sure thing. He began her training young. The wind held constant at 12 miles per hour, ENE. That 12-mile-per-hour crosswind meant a 14-inch drift. She adjusted. She factored in drop, density, even the Earth's spin a vital variable at this distance. She steadied her breathing. In for 4, hold. Out for 8. The rhythm dropped her pulse from its combat spike to the low 60s. The sweet spot, it was automatic now. She established her sight picture, moving 2 inches right to lock in her position. A bad platform kills the shot. The reticle settled. Her pulse throbbed in her chest, her wrist, her throat. She located the pause between beats, that sliver of perfect calm. That was her moment. She pressed the trigger. The familiar kick pushed into her shoulder. She absorbed it and got back on target. A miss, 8 inches right. The tango was already dropping, reacting to the crack of the round. Briggs's voice came over the net from the valley, a mix of disbelief and blame. Only the miss mattered. She recalculated the shot. An unexpected gust had thrown it off. She studied the heat haze shimmering off the rocks, learning its pattern. A lull hit every 8 seconds. 4 clicks left on the windage. She regulated her breathing, dropped her pulse, and waited for the opening. She waited for the 2-second window. Reticle set. Trigger pressed. The heavy machine gun stopped firing. Dunar's calm voice came on the radio. Target down. Guns quiet. She was already repositioning. The next target was 140 meters south at a different altitude, a new firing solution. She moved 30 meters down a scree slope for a clean shot. Moving too fast on a dark slope is a death sentence. She found her position, calculating a 920-meter shot over 2 heat mirages, gauging wind from the grass. 1 trigger press. Threat neutralized. 37 minutes, 6 positions, and the pass was clear. She took apart their defenses systematically. Heavy guns, their crews, then the 2 light machine guns on the exfil path. She shifted positions like a phantom, following the plan she'd made from the start. She only took certain shots. After the first miss, every round hit home. Each silenced gun shifted the fight below. Suppressed squads moved up. Harwick was on the net, pushing teams through her new fire lanes. There was no thought now. The plan was set back at the base. A decision was made. This was simply execution. The job didn't need any more analysis. It demanded only what her father taught: total concentration and the grit to endure where others broke. She never broke. After the final gun went quiet, she swept the ridgeline for 90 seconds, watching the shadows. Confident, she hit the radio. Commander Harwick, ridges are clear, corridors open. Recommend exfil on the main route. A moment of silence. Then Harwick's voice, strained with shock, replied, "Copy that, Doc. What's your 20?" North slope, 80 meters up, on my way down. A longer pause. Come down slow, he ordered. Dunar met her at the bottom. Harwick and a quiet group of Marines stood 10 feet behind. She paid their looks no mind. She went to her pack, secured the rifle, pulled out her medkit, and knelt by the first wounded Marine. Who else is down? An odd silence fell, the kind that follows a reality-bending event. It was not confusion. Every Marine there knew what they'd just seen. They watched the enemy positions get silenced, one after another. They saw her descend, stow her rifle, and immediately treat casualties like it was routine. 37 minutes of unbelievable marksmanship. The quiet that hung in the air was profound. For 4 minutes, Briggs didn't move. Then he approached as she worked on Staff Sergeant Dow, a ricochet to the calf, and just stared at her hands. He had the look of a man reevaluating his entire existence. Finally, he asked, "Where the hell did you learn to do that?" She didn't look up from her work. "My father." "Who is your father?" She glanced at him briefly. "Navy." Briggs looked at Dunar, who looked like a man holding all the cards. Harwick drew near, his commanding officer's face, a careful mask, cracking under the strain of shock. It was a fragile composure. His gaze was locked on her, his mind visibly rewriting every tactical plan he'd ever known. "Cole," he said. "Sir, when you're done." 3 minutes, sir." He stood by. She finished the bandage, rose, and met his eyes. The woman he saw was not the one he knew. "Your father," Harwick stated. "Frank Cole, Master Chief, retired. SEAL Team 3, Desert Storm, Somalia, 3 tours in Afghanistan." He glanced at Dunar. "That's him," Dunar confirmed, and the name hung in the air like a verdict. Briggs was already on his way to the SATCOM, about to pull a service record that would take him all night to process. The valley was quiet, but not peaceful. It was the weighted silence after a storm. She met Harwick's gaze directly. "I have 4 more casualties to check before we can move out, sir." "Then get to it," he ordered. An hour before dawn, the wounded stable, Harwick found her on the perimeter. Leaning against a rock, she methodically restocked her medical kit with practiced automatic movements. He walked toward her carefully. She knew what was coming. "Somalia," he said. Her hand stopped for just a moment. "October 3rd and 4th, 1993. Dad mentioned it twice. Once at 14, because I pried. Again at 20, during a lesson on combat stress." She resumed her work. "The ones who were actually there don't bring it up." "No," Harwick agreed. "They don't." He looked up at the black ridgeline. "He taught you." "Age 10, 6 solid years. Weekends, summers. Windage, drop, trigger control, the pure mechanics of it." A pouch on her gear clicked shut. The training didn't end. By 19, I knew the lessons. After that was just practice. Then he passed, and I promised my mom. Her tone was devoid of emotion. She spent 30 years watching him walk out that door. She had me swear I'd let that side of him die with him. Not the whole man, just the part that wasn't about saving people. I gave my oath. But tonight, the objective was absolute. Her gaze locked with his. "My father taught me a promise is a fortress. You build it to defend something. It's meant to protect what matters. When that fortress becomes a cage, you must choose your allegiance." Harwick read her face. "Sounds like he was one of a kind." "The finest man I knew," she said, her voice flat with conviction. He held the silence. "Chief Dunar called Frank Cole a phantom. That's the highest honor he gives." "Dunar doesn't waste words. He said the same of you." She gave no reply. Harwick rose. "I want a complete AAR at the FOB." "This isn't about the objective," he said, his tone hard. "This is on you. Your jacket, your capabilities. That was a gap in my intelligence. I'm in command here. I know my people. That is protocol." "Dismissed." He turned. "Sir." He stopped cold. "Kowalski has to see a surgeon in under 6 hours. My field dressing is tight, but the clock is running. The medevac is inbound." He gave her one last look. "Cole, get some rack time." She turned back to her equipment. That kind of rest wasn't in her loadout. She went back to the task at hand. Work was something solid. His letter pushed into her thoughts. She'd first read it at 21, inside a cold dorm, while the world carried on, ignorant of that paper's gravity. It surfaced among his effects 2 weeks after the funeral, a single envelope bearing her name. She had opened it in her childhood room, choked by the house's new, crushing quiet. He started with logistics. Ever the planner. Bank details, the lawyer's number, VA forms. It was his last op plan, a map for the fallout. One small mercy in the ruin. Then, the real message began. Tessa, he'd written, I ought to be telling you this face to face, but I'm not sure how long I've got. This world doesn't give you clean exits. I learned long ago to say what's necessary before the fight begins. In the thick of it, there's no time. You promised your mother, and I honor that. I know she only asked because of what I am. Your mother has a kind of wisdom we'll never touch, earned from 30 years of loving a man in this line of work. But I must say this. I trained you, not to be my reflection, but because you needed to know the truth of it. I was never dishonest about that. To truly understand a thing, down to the bone, is to have power over it. Ignorance gets you killed. Knowledge gives you choices. I've trusted your instincts since you were 12. You have an uncommon gift for reading a situation and making the right play. In 40 years of service, I saw that gift in maybe 5 other men. A day will come when you must decide between your oath and the right move. I can't run that drill for you. I can only state my faith that you'll see the difference. Whichever path you take, you earn my respect long before you ever had to choose. It was signed, your father. Simple. Ironclad. She must have read it 100 times and knew it by heart, but she kept the page itself. The paper was real. Its texture, the groove of the pen, the fact that his hand had made those words. She had clutched it at the base of that ridge, moments before shouldering the rifle. Now, in the brittle air, dawn was hardening last night's choices into history. She had to face that promise. She hadn't just bent the promise, she had shattered it. In her mother's kitchen, she had made an oath she meant to uphold. Last night, she burned it to the ground. Both facts were true now. They had to exist together. Her father saw this coming. He knew the promise and the objective would one day collide, and she would recognize it. She had. 60 operators saw that sun rise. Kowalski, just 23, was headed home alive. The 40 men trapped in the kill zone, seconds from being erased, were given another sunrise. She packed that truth away, just another heavy piece of gear to carry, and she watched the light conquer the valley. An hour after sunrise, Briggs appeared. He skipped the pleasantries, found a rock, and just stared at the high ground. Frank Cole, he said finally. I ran his service record on the sat phone. Desert Storm. 11 confirmed, long distance, every one a clean kill. Somalia. 3 tours in the stand, 7 medals, 4 of them were classified above my pay grade. He fell silent. A man's official file is just the cover story. I can't begin to guess the rest. She said nothing. I said something to you when you got here, he continued. I remember. I'd take it back. But that's not how it works. He finally looked at her, settling some debt with himself. I made a command decision with bad intel. That's not how I keep my people breathing. It's a lesson I shouldn't have needed twice. You made the call based on what you knew, she answered. That is the job. I did my job wrong, he countered. Bad process, bad outcome. The quiet stretch between them. Acknowledge it, she said. Then you file it where it can be used. That's what my father would have done. He watched her. Was he the kind of man to let it go at that? He was the kind to say a thing once, and you were damn well expected to get it. She paused. He would spend hours dissecting last night's errors, then conclude the result was acceptable. From him, those words were a unit citation. Briggs considered it, then got to his feet. His bearing had changed. Some internal weight had shifted. For the record, what you did up there was by the book. Any book I've ever read. He turned and walked off. She watched him go. The medevac was wheels up at 0900. She held pressure on 2 casualties, calling out vitals in the steady cadence reserved for men hurt worse than they knew. Kowalski was conscious for most of it. He just watched her, his mouth shut, the smart play. The FOB materialized as they dropped toward the landing zone. She went straight from the bird to the aid station, began the turnover, rattling off every field measure taken and briefing the medics. Her report was meticulous. A sloppy handoff can kill a man who's already beaten the odds. It was a solid 2 hours before she was done. Harwick was waiting for her when she stepped out of the tent. His face was beyond shock and had hardened into a severe demand for clarity. They sat on a couple of Pelican cases. "Give me the rundown," he ordered. "The unit's organic doc, Lieutenant Marsh, went down with appendicitis 4 days ago. The billet was filled from the contractor pool. I put my name in. Why?" She'd been expecting that. "I saw the operations brief. It detailed a single sniper team. I looked at Staff Sergeant Alrek's file. Good Marine, great record, but this kind of terrain demands a second Overwatch team, minimum. The billet was for a medic." Her eyes met his. "I'm qualified for both, so I took the slot." Harwick assessed her. "You knew another capability might be necessary before you boarded that helicopter." "I knew it was a contingency, not a certainty." "You failed to disclose those skills." "My formal qualifications are in my jacket. My time on a rifle is not. My father's training was off the books. It's not in the system for an active billet. SOCOM has no record of it." Her stare was unwavering. "If I'd listed it, things would have gone differently. There are channels to get another shooter assigned. Those channels burn time. I had 4 days. The machine would have sent a warm body to fill a role, not an asset who'd already identified the mission's tactical flaw." He said nothing. "You embedded knowing our vulnerability," he stated, "and you put yourself in a position to patch it without saying a word." "Yes, why all the secrecy?" She considered it. "If I'd shown up as a sniper wearing a medic's patch, we would have been arguing about my credentials, which don't technically exist. I'd have spent this tour defending my position instead of doing my duty." She let the silence hang there. The duty was more critical than the argument. Harwick stood and paced 4 steps, his back to her. He pivoted. "My after-action report tonight will be nothing but the facts," he said. "Every last one. That AAR goes upstairs, and I can't guess how they'll play it. You need to understand that. I do. This could have serious repercussions for you, sir. 3 KIA, 22 wounded, mission failure. This is already a goat rope. What you did is either reported truthfully or it gets buried. And if we bury it, I'm the only one who comes out clean, and my career isn't the mission." He held her gaze. "File the truth," she told him. He gave a single, sharp nod and headed for the command post. She stayed on the case, watching the stark mountains. They looked sharp and defined, like anything seen after a night that cost too much. She touched her chest. "I broke my promise, and it was the correct action. He must have known. I think, somewhere inside, I knew it too." She stood, needing to finish her paperwork. The intel jacket on Owen Graff was delivered at 1300 hours on day 2. Harwick read it twice before calling in his team leaders. It was a thin file. The dangerous ones always are. Born in Knoxville, Tennessee, 1973, Graff joined up at 18. He flew through the Special Operations pipeline that washes out nearly everyone. He made it through Delta selection. The agency's Special Activities Center picked him up in his early 30s. They run the deniable ops from the shadows. The assessment put him in the top 1%. His file called him a tactical prodigy whose conscience lacked the off switch common to his colleagues. He could never just turn it off. The record noted this initially as an asset, then later as a liability. In 2012, he took a 4-man team into Syria on Operation Cardinal. They made contact with the target, but during extraction, their location was blown. They screamed for support on the radio. Air support was inbound. 40 minutes out, it was waved off. The official story was weather, but 2 local posts called it clear skies. 3 Marines were KIA in the ensuing ambush. Graff was captured. For 18 months, he endured a black site where men vanish. His exfil report was a redacted mess. Declared Kia back in December of 2012, he was anything but. For 12 years, he planned his return. His plan was now dug into the surrounding mountains, a strategy born from a decade of pure logic, not rage. His sole mission Hold the brass accountable for their calls. Harwick closed the dossier. This isn't about ideology, Harwick said flatly. He's not an anarchist. He has a specific target: to drag bad command calls into the light and even the score. The silence stretched. That doesn't make it just. It makes him deadlier than any fanatic. A focused operator is always more dangerous than a rabid one. A heavy quiet settled over the TOC. He'll try again tonight, Harwick stated. It was a given. A decade of prep wouldn't break on a single failure. Tessa hung back, absorbing it all. She'd already scanned the file over his shoulder. He'd let her. One glance was all it took. The intel hit hard, redrawing the whole battlefield in her mind. She pictured him in Syria, 2012, getting word that help was coming, just before the comms died. The razor-thin line between salvation and absolute quiet. She thought about what remains of a man after 18 months in that hellhole, how it burns away, faith in the core, the flag, everything. She mulled over the distinct poison of being abandoned by your own people, how it eats a man alive from within. Shaking it off, she headed back to the BAS. The next 4 hours were pure prep. She re-upped her medkits, shifted supplies, and mentally mapped the probable attack corridors from a foe who learned fast. She went over last night's casualty list. Bandages were only a stopgap. After, she choked down a whole MRE. Her dad's voice rattled in her skull. Food and rack time are weapons, not comforts. He wasn't wrong. She crashed for a solid 90 minutes, hitting that deep, strategic sleep only a trained operator can manage on cue. She was in the aid station doing a last gear check when Dunar appeared at 1700 hours. He came in quiet, their gazes meeting. After the last engagement, there was nothing to say. Tonight's a different fight, he said. I know. Last night you owned the dark, now Graf has you zeroed. His stare was intense. He's coming for you. She gave a short nod. You good? She worked her fingers, feeling a hot spot forming on her trigger finger. Just more data on her combat readiness. Good to go, she replied. His expression shifted, the look of a man who'd settled a long debate with himself. Your father sent me an email, he said. January 2019, just before the end. She went still. He brought up a project you were running, said he was proud. The guy hated email. That's how I knew it was critical. Something for the record. Dunar stared at the tent wall. Said you consulted for an NSW project, completely off the books. No credit given. He let that sink in. He described a unified system for battlefield medicine you designed. He called it, and I quote, the single biggest tactical advancement in SOF in 2 decades. Her gaze locked onto a med case, said you stayed anonymous so rank couldn't interfere, said it was the smart play, that it was how you operated. She snapped the case closed. He knew, she whispered. A moment hung in the air, dust danced in the weak light, the wind howled outside. I had my reasons for sitting on this, Dunar said. I knew you were locked on from day one, but I was missing the context. I'd heard scuttlebutt that Frank's kid was tearing up the training doctrine, but I didn't get how big it was, that you were the voice. He held her gaze. Bringing it up earlier could have rattled you. Frank knew you'd execute the mission without any backpatting. Figured I owed you the same courtesy. She met his stare. He always saw the entire chessboard when we only saw the next piece, she said. Damn right. You knew when I got here. I had a hunch. You confirmed it when you dismantled our Overwatch plan in the brief. The whole approach had his mark on it. I was certain. He laid the groundwork, but the structure is all yours. She said nothing. For 3 years, she'd built it in secret. Fitting it in between tours, it was critical. It was more than a new TTP. It was a doctrine. A system she forged to bridge the lethal gap she found between command calls and frontline medicine. Her lessons were delivered on sterile comms. No call sign, no rank, untraceable. The operators who passed her course just called her mentor. The mission was everything. Tonight, her tone was sharp, absolute. Tonight, he agreed. He left her in the dim light of the TOC, so she sought out Harwick. At 2200, Graf's attack exploded. His men poured from the south, erupting from drainage tunnels Intel had written off. The recon brief was mostly on point, except for the detail that would get you killed. 200 enemy poured from 4 coordinated entry points on the south flank. They moved with the practiced grace of a purpose-built team. This wasn't a replay. This was a new script by the same writer, showing he'd learned from his first mistake. The line held for the first 4 minutes. Harwick expected a southern push and had his heavy guns sighted for it. The first wave got chewed up in the razor wire. A second wave hit, then a third right on its heels. They came from 3 vectors simultaneously, and the line collapsed faster than any wargame predicted. The kind of total failure you get when the enemy is already inside your decision cycle. The world went white as Tessa worked in the BAS. 45 seconds later, she was hauling ass to the eastern flank, ducking under a lattice of green tracers. Aid bag in one hand, her M24 slung on her back. She was the doc and the rifleman. Briggs's 12-man team held the eastern line. She arrived and started triage, hitting the priority first, Petty Officer Holloway, with a clean gunshot wound through his thigh. While her hands moved, her brain processed the gunfight. Hostile fire hammered them from a sniper nest 200 meters southeast, creating a textbook kill box over their position. Briggs had 2 guys on suppression, but their angle was garbage. They were just keeping the shooter's head down, not eliminating the threat. She packed Holloway's wound and torqued down the CAT. "Briggs, that ridge at 210, you're blocked." His face told her he knew. 400 meters, 2 nests. The left shooter is sloppy, he shows his head. She was already moving to get a better angle. "Give me 60 seconds of suppression." She used a pallet for cover, found the nest in her optic, and doped the scope for wind and distance, a tougher shot from here. The gunner had a rhythm. Up for 3, down for 4. She watched him for 3 cycles. On the 4th, she pressed the trigger. The left target went down. She low-crawled 40 meters north to get a line on the second shooter, who was already shifting, got prone, found him, sent it. The hostile overwatch went quiet. 30 seconds later, she was back at Holloway's side. Briggs was still processing what he'd just witnessed as she tightened the tourniquet. His head was spinning, so he stayed quiet. She was already on the next casualty. At 22:40, Kowalski collapsed. He was supposed to be rear security on a line that was now the main event. He'd been holding his own, until he just wasn't. His system failed like a blown motor. She'd been tracking his breathing all day, a standard practice for her post-op guys. His O2 sats at 1600 were already shaky. His breathing was ragged, and she'd chalked it up to pain a mistake. It was a diagnostic miss, the kind she worked relentlessly to purge from her method. When his rhythm broke at 22:40, she knew instantly what it was. She was on him in 6 seconds. Tension pneumo. The high altitude and battle stress pushed him over the edge. No breath sounds on the left. Tracheal deviation. Complete respiratory collapse. "Kowalski, stay with me." He couldn't talk. His skin had gone a pale, cyanotic gray, a man suffocating from the inside. She pulled a 14-gauge needle, finding the spot by feel in the utter chaos. Second intercostal space. She plunged it home in one fluid movement. Hesitate on that needle, and you're the one who kills him. A ragged hiss of air left his lungs. Life flooded back into his face. Her hand was rock steady on his ribs, counting breaths, her voice a firm command. "The chest tube is in. You're breathing. Easy now." He obeyed. Under her palm, his vitals began to even out, but her mind was still mapping the firefight. It was a headspace she lived in. Then, the rhythm of the battle shattered. The volume of fire from the west tripled. An enemy gunner had found a dominant position. Her eyes snapped up from Kowalski. 70 meters out, Harwick was pinned down in the open by a supply bunker. Shifting the fire team had been the right call, but leading from the front always has a cost. The lane was clear a minute ago. Now it was a death trap. A tango on the berm, 240 meters out, had Harwick dialed in and was pressing the trigger. She knew she had 3 heartbeats. Letting go of Kowalski, she barked at the Marine next to him. "Hold pressure on this. Do not let him move." She didn't run to Harwick, but to a stack of crates 8 meters away that gave her the angle. No time to hit the deck. She took a knee, rifle already seated in her shoulder. Her pulse hammered. No time to breathe. She centered the reticle and squeezed. The 240-meter problem was gone. Harwick's head snapped around, his eyes flicking from the downed enemy to her. She was already moving back to her casualty. Her hand was back on his chest, checking the seal, resuming the work her shot had interrupted. Her father's words echoed from a bone-cold November day when she was 20. On the rifle range, she'd asked how he squared the man he was with the things he had to do. He considered it for a long moment. Then, you don't. There's no line. There are just your hands, and they do what they're trained to do. The talent is knowing which hand to use for the job and having the will to use it. She felt for Kowalski's pulse with one hand, her other scanning the line. The realization hit her, instant and complete. She wasn't becoming him. She was becoming what he always knew she could be. The message was simple. Be better than I was. Owen Graff ordered the pullback at 23:14 hours. At the time, HQ didn't grasp the real reason for the retreat. The official AAR would cite tactical failures, losing key terrain, failed assaults, and the defenders' superior fire control. All true. But the boots on the ground knew the real story. They said the attack simply broke. A cold fear gripped the enemy, the kind that comes from facing something you can't possibly understand. The enemy saw that the firebase wasn't even close to folding. Every push was met with a precise, brutal defense. Every probe that should have worked was crushed instantly. A mind graph hadn't planned for was running the defense, and his men could feel it. The base held an ace his intel had completely missed. The assault force melted into the dark. Harwick had birds spooling up 4 minutes after they bugged out. The position was sterile and gone in 17 minutes. She was on the third helo, a hand on 2 casualties. Her calm voice, their only anchor. The mountains dissolved into blackness. She focused on their vitals, boxing out everything else. That was the mission. Graff was captured 3 days later. Harwick made damn sure he was there for the intake. The request was fast-tracked. He faced a 51-year-old man with the grim resolve of someone who'd spent 12 years in the suck. Graff's hands were still, his expression carved from stone. He looked at Harwick with the quiet resignation of a man who knows the bill has come due. Harwick let the silence hang in the air. Syria, 2012, he said. Graff gave a slight, sharp nod. Correct. And the outcome for your unit? You've read the jacket. Tell me anyway. Graff locked eyes with him and began. For 40 minutes, he gave a clinical debrief that sucked all the air from the room. Harwick stood his ground, offering no easy words. An apology would be worthless. This entry will be placed in your service record, backdated 12 years. I'll see to it personally. Graff's eyes lifted, the first crack in his stoic facade. It wasn't forgiveness, just acknowledgement. It was the look of a man carrying a crushing weight who'd just found someone who understood the load. That is sufficient, Graff said. Harwick's own AAR was 47 pages. He passed the info to her like a tactical report. His report was a raw, unfiltered assessment of her performance. It detailed the 22 casualties she handled in 2 nights, her life-saving interventions, and the tactical mind behind every move she made. His final point was blunt. He also noted her unconventional access, which yielded results impossible through standard command channels. 4 days later, in a sterile briefing room, he delivered his final recommendation. A 2-star wants to see you, Thomas Caldwell. He's been running a joint training command at NavSpec Warcom for 4 years. 3 years ago, he signed off on a black box instructional program, a pilot course. A corner of Harwick's mouth hitched up. He greenlit it, having no idea who the author was. Her expression was a blank slate. He's requesting a meeting, not ordering one. He wants to discuss the curriculum and making it doctrine. Harwick could read her thoughts. He also said if he'd known it was you, he would have approved it without a moment's hesitation. She weighed that, the sheer scale of the change, 4,000 operators, the jump from a ghost program to official doctrine. She compared the clean efficiency of her secret protocol to the raw power of an institutional one. I'll take the meeting, she said. Harwick gave a single nod, his gaze locking with hers. My son is 22. He's at BUD-S. I think about the training he'll get coming through that pipeline. Then I think about the holes in that training, the wall we build between being a medic and being a shooter, how we drill that divide into them. He let the words hang there. Your program is what he needs, what they all need. He stood. I'm thankful you were on deck. It was Dunar who told the men. The news dropped on the evening of the 5th day. The main squad bay was packed with a few hundred of the 480-man force. The rest crowded the passageway, straining to hear. Word like that travels fast. Tessa was unavailable, buried in paperwork at the BAS. Dunar stood before the formation and gave them the straight dope. He spoke about Frank Cole. Not the biography, but the measure of the man. He described a legacy built over 30 years, his gut-level understanding of the mission, and the successor he was quietly training. He spoke of a daughter who earned a legacy not through her name, but through 1,000 pre-dawn formations and a lifetime of relentless focus. He talked about a promise made on a dark night in some godforsaken valley. Then, the gunny dropped the bomb about their instructor. He was blunt, no fluff, the kind of direct talk they understood. The anonymous teacher from the past 3 years, the voice behind their CASEVAC drills, was the civilian doc who'd been right there with them. That calm, precise voice on the net during the second night's fight, the one calling plays like she wrote the book on it, was hers. And she did it all from behind a rock, while nursing a fresh bullet wound in her own shoulder. A heavy silence fell over the room, the kind of tense quiet that comes before a lightning strike. In the third row, Corporal Reed Kowalski had heard that instructor's voice 42 times in 3 years. He'd never put a face to the call sign. The program demanded total anonymity. Listening to the gunny, he replayed 42 lessons that had completely rewired his mind for the battlefield. Images flooded his mind. A dry wadi, a tourniquet applied in under 90 seconds, a needle decompression done in pitch black, a steady hand on his chest that calmed his breathing. He rose to his feet, without a word. The Marine next to him stood. Then another. A current passed through a room of men cut from the same cloth. No one gave an order. It was pure gut instinct. Down the hall, Marines who only caught pieces of the story were getting to their feet. Kowalski found her at the battalion aid station. He'd been on his feet for 2 days, his lungs slowly knitting itself back together. He was weak, but he could move. He sat across from her as she plowed through reports, just watching. I recognized your voice, he said, his own voice raspy. She paused for a moment. 3rd training cycle, he clarified. 2 years ago, September, the Moscow exercise, an IED, building collapse. You said, triage for effect, not for speed. The loudest casualty is not always the priority. Save the greatest number you can. Don't get sucked into one dramatic rescue. The words hung between them. I've run that lesson through my head maybe 400 times. It changed how I do my job. She set her pen down. That is correct, she said. He nodded. So why the ghost routine? He asked. She weighed her answer. Because attaching my name to it would have started a bureaucratic pissing match about a civilian contractor teaching tactics to operators. Her eyes met his. And that would have made it about me, not about the material. The material is all that matters. The doctrine had to stand on its own. He chewed on that. 314 classes. 3 years. About 14 guys per class. He calculated aloud. That's over 4,000 operators running your system. He paused. It's why we pulled it off. She looked up. You need some rack time, she said. That lung's not at 100%. I know. He got up. He met her gaze, his face showing a man shaken to his foundations. Doc, he said from the hatch. She looked over. He gave a firm nod. She gave one back. The shoulder repair took 2 hours. It was a textbook job, and the surgeon called for a full recovery. She came out from under the anesthesia sharp, like a computer booting up. Harwick was at her bedside. He looked up from his datapad. Surgery was clean. The sawbones gave me the full after-action report. He put the datapad aside. Got a buzz from Admiral Caldwell while you were out. He's been pushing for this joint training for 4 years. Greenlit the ghost protocol on pure faith. Harwick met her stare. Said if he knew it was your project, he'd have rubber-stamped it with a blank check. His endgame? to make this whole operation official. Real funding, total command buy-in, a full-scale deployment. He's not trying to poach you. He wants to talk architecture. Build a new path forward with you. Not just shuffle papers. Her eyes locked on the ceiling. She envisioned 4,000 operators adopting a new combat doctrine like it was gospel. She reran Kowalski's figures, feeling the immense gravity of that many boots on the ground using a new playbook. She weighed the safety of staying a ghost against the power of going official, wondering if the scale of it changed the mission. Set up the meet, she ordered. Harwick nodded. A beat passed. My AAR is in the system. It's all there. Your actions are now part of the permanent record. Period. She looked him dead in the eye. Good. Briggs arrived the day she was cleared for movement, amid the pre-dawn energy of the base. He seemed to be running on sheer determination, outpacing any second thoughts. He sat down. His eyes fell to his lap. When you got hit, he started, I shot my mouth off. Just hear me out. She was silent. I made a battlefield call on bad intel in less than 30 seconds. What I said was dead wrong. Completely. He finally looked at her. You were right. I was covering my team. But I let a gut feeling become hard fact in my head. That's not tactics. It's a character flaw. One that has cost me before. I should have known better. The silence was heavy. I'm sorry. She held his gaze. Accepted, she said flatly. He gave a short nod. Then I need a seat. In the first course. Her brow creased. Course? Caldwell's new program. The first rotation. His look was intense. I'm 41. A dozen years in the teams, and for a dozen years, I treated medicine and combat like two separate jobs, which means my entire methodology has been wrong for 12 years. I have to be in that class. She met his gaze for a long moment. You're on the list, she said. He rose to leave. One final look. Your father, he stated, for all his issues, he raised you right. Then he was gone. 6 months later, the exhaustion had finally vanished from her face. The 9 pounds she had dropped between the fight and the hospital were back, her body finally stepping down from a combat footing. Her left shoulder still sent out a sharp signal on cold mornings. A deep, persistent ache, the surgeon said, might never fully go away. She logged it as an equipment issue, not a personal weakness. Her days began at 0530 with a 6-mile loop, the Pacific on her left. The lights of Coronado glittered in the crisp air below. Always the same path. Her father had drilled into her that routine is not a cage. It's the framework that holds when everything else gives way. After her run in Chow, she went to the Integrated Combat Medicine Center. The second class had just kicked off, 2 weeks after the first had graduated. The first course had 16 students. This one had 22. 47 were lined up for the third. From the doorway, she sized them up. 22 operators, from 22 to 44, with a collective eternity spent in hell. Orders put them there, but the scuttlebutt filled the classroom. The word on the street was that this program hands you a weapon you don't even see until it's the last one you have. Reed Kowalski sat near the back. He dropped his request chit the second he was cleared for duty, angling for this specific class. He didn't pull rank, getting his spot on his own merit like the other 21. His eyes followed her in. They exchanged a quick nod. Third row, Colt Briggs was locked on, posture perfect, his focus absolute. He was a student, not a peer reviewer. He looked like a man whose foundation had been shattered and was now painstakingly rebuilding it, brick by brick. Behind her, at the front of the room, 11 words were on the whiteboard. She had written them before the first class ever started, alone with thoughts of her father, the valley, and the legacy she was forging. It wasn't stenciled or printed, just her handwriting in a marker that wouldn't quit a creed that was never erased. It wasn't part of the official curriculum. It was the entire program's core principle. Heal when you can, fight when you must, know the difference. Her eyes scanned the room, 22 men from different commands, all carrying their own burdens, their shared ground. They had all been at that crossroads and were here to sharpen the instinct for it. One Tuesday in November, she called her mother, the ocean air coming through her window. The sound of the surf had been her only company for 6 months. Her mother, at 63, still lived in the family house, keeping the garden her father had run with platoon sergeant discipline. When he died, her mother took on the garden, calling it the most peculiar part of her mourning. It was her method for keeping him around, by seeing his mission through. They spoke for 40 minutes. She confirmed her shoulder was combat effective. It was true. Her mother asked about the program. Tessa gave her the summary of the second group. Different backgrounds, one mission, and the immense satisfaction of teaching something critical to men who would use it to save lives. A quiet hung between them. Then her mother said, "I was terrified when I got the call. Just pure dread, then anger, then back to dread. I know. I just kept thinking about what your dad would have said, and that you understood the mission objective, that you were exactly where you had to be. He was the one who taught me to read the terrain," she said. "That he did," her mother confirmed. "I know, he told me." Her mother's voice became lighter, as if a heavy load had been lifted. "He always saw the whole battlefield, Tessa. This was on his map. Damn right it was. Are you okay with it now?" Tessa looked out over the endless black water. "I am," she said, "for some time. We just needed to say it." "Good," her mom said. "That's what's important." Later, she took out the letter. It had been in her jacket pocket for 5 years and 3 months. She sat at her desk, the unopened letter in her hand. There was no point in opening it. The words were already memorized. It had become part of her operating code, less a command and more the very structure of her principles. She felt the weight of the paper. His lesson resurfaced. The space between an order and the principle behind it. The moment an operator has to trust their own internal compass. Trust your gut when the plan falls apart. She did. She had made the right decision. She opened a drawer, placed the letter exactly in the center, and shut it. Not hidden, not filed, simply put away. She didn't need to carry it anymore. The directive had become instinct. She had rehearsed its meaning for 5 years until it was automatic. Monday morning, 0800. The Pacific light filled the classroom as she stood before the men, the bass a low hum outside. 22 operators stood ready. 11 words were written on the board in permanent marker. Her mission statement, her code. Last night's intel brief. The third class had twice the number of applicants. 2 other commands wanted to copy the training. The Syria after-action report was in the system. It was classified, but the facts of the op were now permanent history. She turned the raw data into tactical wisdom. Her eyes landed on Kowalski in the back, notebook ready. He had the intense stare of a man who knew these lessons were paid for in blood. Her gaze shifted to Briggs, third row, his posture impeccable, a testament to how discipline can rebuild a man. She thought of her father and his 0530 6-mile runs back in San Diego. He knew the missions that truly counted are never reported, never awarded a medal, and never spoken of again. A true legacy is the skill you build in others, the instinct that lives on after you. It's not the rounds you fire, but the knowledge you leave behind. A memory flashed the valley, a dark mountain, the envelope, the 2-second decision to ignore a direct order for a higher principle. The numbers were burned into her mind. 63 dead to save 477. She carried the cold math of command. Her mother's words came back to her. She pictured the letter at rest in the drawer after 5 years of standing guard over her conscience. She knew what it was to walk through hell. She saw them 22 men who had made that same journey and were here to learn how to make it back. She took a long, calming breath. "All right, gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Time to get started." And the training began.